Welcome to my conversation with retired Admiral Bobby Ray Inman. He's a retired four-star admiral from the United States Navy, former deputy director of the CIA, former director of the NSA, and he has also held many other top positions in government, the intelligence community, and also in business. He's someone who I'm fortunate enough to be able to call one of my mentors. We didn't get to everything in this conversation, especially on the business side of things, as he actually brought technology to Austin before it was cool back in the 80s. He was the CEO of MCC, the company that is titled Microelectronics and Computer Technology Corporation, and that was really when he brought the tech scene to Austin. He was also a board member of both Dell and Oracle as they went public, and he has since served on the board of directors of many other startups that he advises through his work in venture capital. It's always a pleasure being able to talk with him, and I hope that you get a lot of value out of this conversation. Please don't forget to share if you found this at all valuable, and I hope to be doing more of these in the future. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Admiral Bobby Ray Inman. Well, welcome, Admiral Inman. I appreciate you taking the time to be on this interview. I know a lot of people will get a lot of value out of what you have to say, as was the case with me. So thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
I'd like to start out with your time in the intelligence community, being deputy director of the CIA, as well as the director of the NSA and many other, I'm sure, very interesting positions that you held. Take us back in time. What was the world like at that time? What were the tensions, and what issues did you have to deal with in those positions?
I went to officer candidate school and was commissioned as an ensign because of the Korean War, and served on an aircraft carrier for 2 cruises before the armistice was signed. And I then tried to get out early, and they laughed at me, no early outs. But they ended up sending me to Paris for duty, and from Paris to London. And Admiral Cassidy persuaded me to stay in the Navy. So I went to to a cruiser, Pacific, 2 years. Told me I needed postgraduate school. Navy's postgraduate school is beautiful Monterey, California, for all except one course. The curriculum in Naval Intelligence was taught in Washington, D.C., in the District of Columbia. So that's the course they selected me for. I went back complaining. When I finished, I ended up going to the Pentagon to be a watchstander in the Navy's flag plot, the command center for the Navy. But the day I went in for my first watch was the coup in Iraq in '58. So instead of going on the watch bill, I went on the task force for the crisis. The end of July, new crisis, Taiwan Straits. So I went on that task force. Last Friday, the chief of naval operations was Admiral Arleigh Burke, a great World War II hero. And he began his morning with all the admirals in the Navy Department, handful of captains gathered. 30-minute briefing, 10 minutes on intelligence, what was going on in the world, 10 minutes on naval operations, 10 minutes on congressional relations, media relations, weather. No script, stand and talk. Captains and commanders, colonels, lieutenant colonels did most of the briefing. Last Friday in August '58, the captain intel briefer was on travel. One of the 2 commanders was on leave. The other came late, read summaries, answered a question off the top of his head. Admiral Burke ordered the 7th Fleet moved. We no longer had operational authority to do that. When we went to get the Joint Chiefs to ratify it, found it operated on inaccurate info. 24 hours to get him out of town. The big question was what to do on Saturday morning. He didn't have a schedule, so things were relaxed. And they said, just put on a substitute. Director of Naval Intelligence tagged Lieutenant Inman to be the briefer. I got nervous all over again because as I would brief on a country, Admiral Burke would ask me about every country around it. And we ended up touring the world for 25 minutes. And he turned with a great flourish to the Director of Naval Intelligence and said, leave the lieutenant on the briefing team as Commander Massey's successor. So my whole life changed from that moment. I had a year and a half, great time with that job. Went to a destroyer, got picked up early for a promotion, clearly because of the briefing job. And then went to, was selected for intelligence specialists and went to the National Security Agency for tracking the Soviet Navy, just becoming a blue water Navy. From there, that got me deeply involved, Cuban Missile Crisis. After 3 years doing that, I had a brief 2 months of language study training, and end of the year, my wife and I and a 2-year-old son went to Stockholm to be an assistant naval officer. But the reason I was there was the Swedes had asked for help in analyzing what they were collecting on the Soviet Navy in the Baltic and while they were doing submarine cruises near their territorial waters. It made the attaché tour a lot more interesting than it would have been. 2.5 years. From there, had a current intelligence Pacific Fleet. 21 months later, out to be the 7th Fleet intelligence officer for 2.5 years. Family living in Japan. Back to the National War College. Pulled out of intelligence to be the executive assistant, the Navy's vice chief. 2.5. I had 3 different vice chiefs in the 18 months. Then to Hawaii again, be the assistant chief of staff for intelligence for Pacific Fleet. A month after I got there, lightning struck. I got picked up very early for a first star. 1 July, my 3rd vice chief moved up to be the chief of naval operations. And he brought me back in September to be the director of naval intelligence. Heady time, congressional investigations, Church and Pike Committee, plus reorienting. I suddenly had 3,600 people working for me and reoriented to with Vietnam essentially behind us. Lightning struck again, 21 months along, and I got promoted from 1 star to 3 and became the vice director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. President Ford lost the election, but to my great amazement, when President Carter came in, I got a second 3-star assignment, director of the National Security Agency. So I was at DIA 3 weeks shy of a year. And I had the NSA job for 44 wonderful months. Best job I ever had. Planned to retire. Got shanghaied by the new Reagan administration and by the president to be the deputy director of CIA. But my request was no more than 18 months, 2 years. He agreed, and I left at 18 months. So that's a long-winded rundown of an almost 31-year career in the Navy, 22 years of that in the intelligence world.
I'm curious to know, what's that like, having conversations with President Reagan or Carter and really seeing the impact of those decisions that you and them make, and really understanding that I think what a lot of people can fall into is thinking that geopolitical concerns are somebody else's problem or it's out there.
Yeah.
What's it like talking with them, first of all, on a personal basis, as well as just in your work, understanding the implications?
Well, remember, this was the heart of the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
And the first president with whom I interacted, had direct dialogue, was President Ford. And that came about because of the congressional investigations. When I'd served in the vice chief's office, one of my requirements every day was to track how the Navy writ large had dealt with the Congress, constituent relations, the testimony, appropriations, and all authorization. And I learned in that how important the staffs were. So, as I told you earlier, I got reported to be the director of Naval Intelligence 16 September 74. In November, Seymour Hersh began publishing his articles about all the perfidy of the intelligence agencies for 25 years of Cold War. And Church Committee was formed, Senate High Committee in the House, hired staffs, and they sat out. And when the first staffs on the Senate Committee came to look at the Navy, I met the staffs. I read the same files they read. And we talked about no dispute about what we found, some dispute about what it meant. But I ended up as the first head of any of the agencies ready to testify. I asked for closed hearings, had only closed hearings. They went well. None of my peers had ever dealt with Congress, except for the director of Central Intelligence himself, Bill Colby. They didn't meet the staffs. They didn't read the files. They began in open sessions, being surprised by things found in their files. And the ranking Republicans in Senate and the House went to see President Ford. Said, you got to do something. They're going to destroy the intelligence community. And there's an old congressional hand. He said, is anything going right? And they said, well, those hearings from the young Admiral Navy Department have gone fine. His next question, as he told me later, was, do they trust him? And they said, well, we do. He said, okay, go back to the chairman. Next time there's any flap, any of the agencies, have Inman come over, read the material that you have, tell the committee what he thinks it means, please. I did a lot of that over the next 6 months. And when the hearings were finally finished, I had strong support, both sides of the aisle, both houses of Congress. And that's what led me into the conversations with President Ford. So when Rumsfeld fired the leadership of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the big question was who to promote to be the vice director. That's when President Ford reached in to direct the outcome. Starting with President Carter, he was interested in all details about everything. It was not a warm and friendly scene. When I went to see him, one of the early times, about a year and a half into the job, it was to tell him that the Soviets were listening to his telephone calls to various heads of state around the world, where they didn't have direct secure communications. And he sort of huffily said, Admiral, you mean it would be safer if I went out and used the payphone on 17th Street? And my answer was, can't say be safer for your health, but it would be safer for your communications. As time went on, he became a pretty avid consumer. CIA had provided us keying material for a sometime friendly country. When I look at the product, it was imminently leakable. So I decided rather than sending it electronically, I would send it by courier, print copy only, to 9 people by name. Got a phone call from President Carter saying it was fascinating, would be very embarrassing if it leaked, but if I could get more of it, he'd like to see it. And if I did get more, he took 4 names off the list. He knew who talked to the media. Fast forward, the Desert One effort, where they were headed to try to rescue the hostages seized by the Iranians. And President Carter decided that he would not try another rescue operation. Rather, they would rely on diplomacy. And he was sending the Deputy Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, forward to do the negotiations. Lord Cutler was the general counsel. He'd been involved with Enigma in World War II, and he'd been special counsel on the Brownell Commission that led to the creation of the National Security Agency. So he was well acquainted with what we did. And he called me on the secure phone to ask where in the Middle East should they place Christopher for me to have a reasonable chance of tracking the flow of information. When President Carter made a decision, would they understand it? When it came back, would we in fact get it? When he hung up, President Carter said, "What'd you just do? Where'd you get that?" I said, "Secure phone, we call the director of NSA." They sent Christopher abroad, and President Carter started calling me to say, "I have just made the following decision, and this is what I need to know." With that clarity of guidance, we were able to answer his questions somewhere between 80 and 85% of the time. The day after the election, which he lost, when he called, I finally got up my courage to tell him I had long planned to go visit my Australian colleagues in that time right after the election, and was leaving 2 days later. He said, "Well, Admiral, when I call you, who do you call?" I said, "Well, the director of the NSA SIGINT Operations Center." He said, "Well, can I have your permission to call the director of NSA while you're absent?" And he did a couple of times. We continued. My last conversation with him in the Oval Office came about 10 o'clock in the morning on the 20th of January, when he was generous to call and tell me he had just awarded me the Naval Intelligence medals. And my last conversation with him as president was when he was in the limo going down Pennsylvania Avenue with the president-elect to tell him that the hostages were in the aircraft at the end of the runway, but would not be permitted to take off till he was no longer president.
I'd be curious to know, as you were saying about phones getting tapped and information leaking, how much of a role does technology play in not only preventing things from getting out like that, but also when you're gathering intelligence on other countries? I'm sure technology has changed in leaps and bounds since then, but during your time there, what role did it play?
Well, most countries employed encryption for their diplomatic traffic and their military traffic. And some had cryptography that was of a level that was very difficult, if not impossible, to break. Many others had less secure, which you could in fact read and provide to the US consumers, and occasionally some of our allied consumers, the details in the process. But in those days, most traffic flowed high frequency communications, beginning of line of sight, microwave, beginning of satellite communications. Long after my time, and undersea cables. Long after my time, fiber optic cables, and the explosion of the internet and social media. And so technology in that case afforded vastly more opportunities to access information. Now, the question was the ability to assimilate it and to be able to digest and get it out to consumers while it was relevant, not after it become history. And of course, a very large percentage of the time, it was in other languages. So it had to be translated before you could send it out to consumers. So it demanded a pretty large workforce, very able workforce in the process. When you think about intelligence collection, like you should think in three different domains: communications, signals, radar, telemetry, all those called signal intelligence. Imagery, which moved from Civil War days of balloon collection to aircraft to satellites, and human. And human divided into overt and clandestine. Overt were our diplomats posted in foreign countries, foreign service, military attaches. They provided a large volume of overt human observation, dialogues, travel, and all. The clandestine, run initially just by CIA, and then later by DIA to some lesser extent, were aimed at how did you get at the secrets that governments did not want you to have, not open source or easily available dialogue. Now, bottom line, protection of sources and methods was always a critical concern. For imagery, the concern was, when it was aircraft, that they'd get shot down, the U-2. For satellites, you felt somewhat more secure in the process and less likely that they would be interdicted. Signals, constant worry that countries not realize how much intelligence you were deriving from their communications. And any hint that you were, they'd change their codes and ciphers or change the means by which they transmitted communications. On the human side, on the overt side, you simply didn't want to deny people to have access. But there was rarely any threat to their livelihood. On the clandestine side, you were sometimes at risk that the spies who were working for you would get captured, imprisoned, killed, or that the agent would get banged. Agents exceedingly rarely got killed, but it was not that infrequent that they got beaten up, put in jail for a short time frame. So does that make the case for you to understand the vulnerabilities and concerns?
Yes. Yeah. And on that topic of technology, I'm curious to get your take on what you think the implications of AI is. I know it's much more recent than probably in your time, although you may have seen some of it. But when you have all this data that's there, it's quite a chore, to say the least, to sift through. So I'm curious what you think about AI and pulling out the signal from the noise.
In my time, which is now plus 40 years ago, we used AI when we were going to leave a listening device behind and maybe not be able to access it for months. And we used AI to know when to turn on, when to turn off, so that you didn't use all your recording capability in the first week or 2 weeks in the process. Now, the role AI plays is much less on the collection side than on the processing and analytical side. How do you sift through the vast volume of information that's available to find in a timely way that which is relevant to what your consumers want to know? During the days of the Cold War, Soviets maintained exceedingly tight control over publications. Izvestia and Pravda were the only regular publications, and they controlled all the content. Suddenly, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of 1991, on January 92, within months, with 15 different countries, you had more than 200 newspapers and radios. They were out there in different languages. But suddenly you went from difficulty to hear anything to being swamped with data. And that's only grown dramatically with the advent of social media.
And do you foresee any challenges with pulling that signal out from the noise and balancing that with infringing on people's privacy? Because I know that's a concern too. In perhaps with good intention, you can collect a lot of this information trying to pull out the signal of potential terrorism activities and so on, when a lot of people would also say that that could infringe on their privacy, because once that door is open, then could that be a vulnerability for them?
There are great concerns about that, and they're mostly uninformed or from media stories that leave the impression that it's something widespread. First, there are laws, executive orders, which tell the agencies what they can do and what they cannot do. And NSA was prohibited from directly collecting against United States citizens. That was primarily the danger was in the US. When you were looking for foreign communications, how did you sort that out from the vast volume? And the process is called minimization. Every employee was required once a year to refresh, sign that they understood that they could only report information that had been derived from US citizens if there was a clear violation of the law or direct threat to national security. And then you had to identify exactly the surrounding circumstance. So for the vast array, you could not only could you not target, you had no way to deal with it other than to suppress it, not report on what was there. Where this became a problem was when a foreign embassy would report home a conversation with a US citizen.
Mm.
And there, the requirement was that you conceal the identity of the US citizen who was being quoted. And that got sometimes into pretty tricky terrain. If it happened to be the president's brother or whatever along the way. Edward Snowden conveyed the image that the Church and Pike committees had earlier, that NSA was listening to the conversations of US citizens constantly. And what he was actually referring to was metadata. Mm-hmm. This all came about long after my time. But where you wanted the headings, what number had called, what number did they call, what email address did they send? And what you were trying to do when you were dealing with terrorists was to sort out who were potential terrorists inside the United States. This is closing the barn door after 9/11, when we were not permitted to track cell phones at all. And so the thrust was that you had to still, if you accidentally got it, you had to suppress it. And what the metadata did, it told you connections, but it gave you none of the dialogue. So you did not know what was talked about. So the privacy was not really invaded. Now, this is an ongoing challenge. It popped up more recent years when Apple declined to give the code to the FBI to break classified calls. And so I asked my students, every time you get on the internet, you're being tracked for commercial purposes. If you don't believe it, just look at the ads that pop up.
That's right.
So what I asked my students, 42 law, public affairs, MBA students, how many of you regularly read print newspapers? 5 or 6 hands. How many of you regularly listen to broadcast news or PBS? Same 5 or 6 hands. How many of you primarily get your information on what's going on off the internet? 42 hands in the process. So that's where you go for information. Now, if that's where you go, if that's where businesses are tracking where you go, what's the problem with the government knowing what business are you? And the answer I got back, I think, was, well, under those circumstances, I guess we wouldn't care if the government knew what. We just want our parents to know. So
that's funny. Well, I'd like to pivot to more current affairs, specifically with what's been going on in the last few months with Russia. So a lot of people know people in both Ukraine and Russia who've been just affected by all the chaos that's occurring. I know people individually who I'm working with who I've hired who have just had their lives turned upside down. I'm curious to know your take out of all the experience that you've had in this world of analyzing these situations, stepping through what might be going on in the other person's head. What do you think is going on with Russia? How are you looking at this situation with Putin? Is it really the, I guess, simple narrative of just this evil dictator that's being painted? Or is there something that's 5 moves ahead that most people aren't seeing? What's your take on this?
Well, first, Putin has made it abundantly clear for many years that he considered the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century being the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that once he became president, he was intent on trying to reassemble Greater Russia. We saw his crackdown in Chechnya, 2004, when they were trying to secede. We saw his going into Georgia in 2008. We saw his taking Crimea in 2014 and began taking some of the eastern part of the Ukraine. Intelligence here was superb in identifying his preparation for an invasion, multi-pronged invasion into the Ukraine. To my substantial surprise, we declassified a lot of that early and told our allies and substantial to be the American public that this was likely to happen. And it did. So that was not a surprise. What was a surprise was the skillful wartime leadership of a former actor who had become the president of Ukraine, Zelensky. And no one, I think, predicted that he would turn into a forceful leader. After having watched the Vietnam forces collapse, then watching many of the Iraqi forces collapse when ISIS came along, and watching the Afghan military collapse, the real surprise was the fight that the Ukrainians put up. Then you go back and look at who else had demonstrated the will to fight: the Kurds in Iraq and Syria. The key element here, hard to predict in advance, the will to fight. And it clearly, that's what kept Kiev from being captured. It was clear Putin's plan was a blitzkrieg in, capture the capital in 3 days, throw out Zelensky, put a puppet in his place, and declare victory. We got a good sign of his intent with his conversation with the German chancellor, one of the last visitors just before the invasion, when Putin said, Ukraine isn't a country, it's part of Russia. It has no right to exist as a separate country in the process. I guess the other surprise is that what Putin accomplished in unifying NATO that I had not predicted, or getting Germany to step up their defense spending, others. So Putin now faces a far more unified West. Will it hold? Hard to say. But as you look, where are his ambitions? Assemble Greater Russia. He's not that interested in bringing back in the Muslim-speaking republics along the southern border, though he wants to control their oil and gas production. But he does want to bring back all the Slavic-speaking countries that were part of it. So that says all the rest of Ukraine, Moldova, Belarusia, the Baltic republics are clearly on his acquisition list. And it's that last three, the Baltic republics, that would plunge us into a much larger scale war, because they are members of NATO. And Article 5 says attack on any of them is an attack on us.
Where do you see this going from here on out? I mean, clearly it's past the point of no return and each side seems to have solidified. Would you see Putin just leaving?
Much depends on how the Ukrainian forces do in eastern Ukraine. If they succeed in halting the Russian advance, then what does Putin, does he accept a stalemate? Does he declare victory for what he's gained, the land bridge from Mariupol to Crimea, and as much of the eastern Ukraine as he can hold? And what would the Ukrainians do? Would they accept that to end the fighting, the constant missiles and artillery attacks on their civilian populations process? That's the unknown that's out in front of us in the process.
Mm-hmm. And as all this is being focused on in Ukraine with Russia, what do you think we're not seeing with as much intensity going on in China? I'm curious to get your take on what you see with them. They've obviously employed their top-down mentality to a lot of things while also seemingly trying to capture as much of that Western entrepreneurial spirit as they can. Do you see them as much of a threat as Russia, or what are your perspectives on China?
1976, Mao Zedong died, and the Cultural Revolution came to an end. And it took 2 years for Deng Xiaoping to have control in a shared responsibility fashion, and to launch in 78 the modernization of China. At that point, in a population of a little over 1 billion, somewhere between 100,000, 150,000 people were prosperous, lived good lives. The remainder were poverty-stricken. Deng Xiaoping's incredible success, unlocking entrepreneurial talents, telling people they could leave the party and go get rich, and they did in large numbers, and then find a way to bring them back to relate to the government. By the time Xi took over in 2012, the process that Deng Xiaoping had put in place had been sustained. You're now at a population of about 1.3 billion. Somewhere between 600 million, 700 million of those are now prosperous. A large middle class, buying apartments on mortgages, buying cars, traveling in the process. And the second 5-year plan under Xi aimed to bring in another 100 million out of poverty. Still leaves a large number who aren't. But the willingness to accept the Communist Party complete control, the exact opposite direction for which the Russians went, was because they were getting prosperous. Material gains. They were living better in the process. Last 3 years, she has moved to curtail the independence, the flexibility of the private sector. That's where the bulk of the innovation has occurred. But with that enormous growth and wealth, they've also built a very large military, not tested in combat, but lots of money into hardware, air, Navy, ground, and clearly enough to intimidate their neighbors, plus a program to both extend access to raw materials for their economy and markets. The One Belt, One Road incursions across Central Asia, into Europe, down through Africa, throughout. Not gifts, not grants, loans. And we're now getting toward the stage when a lot of those loans are coming due and the countries can't pay back. We've already seen it in Sri Lanka, where in response, China took over the large container port that they built for them on the west coast, Sri Lanka. And we're likely to see more of that across Africa, other places. What's now come on top of all that is the pandemic. And it's clearly had already impacted on Chinese growth. But what had occurred from that 78 to 2020? China had become the factory floor for much of the world. For just-in-time inventory, down your costs, relying on things being manufactured in China to be at your doorstep in a week or a month, depending on what the pace, the need was. And suddenly, when everything stopped with COVID, and you discovered it wasn't just national security, healthcare, masks, gowns, so many of the things made in China, not accessible. So what it's touched off is the global revisit of supply chains. That's really just getting underway. That will be accelerated by the much more recent crackdown in Shanghai, Shenzhen, where a good deal of that manufacturing base the rest of the world depended on is closed. We don't know yet what the impact is going to be on the Chinese economy this year, but it's likely to be less than 4% growth. And they're accustomed to 7.5% growth and expansion. Will they be able to continue expanding the size of the middle class? Or will there be some recession? And will that make people less inclined to stay out of politics, to want to get more involved? So what you need to watch, Deng Xiaoping put in place that you could govern for up to 10 years, 2 5-year terms. No repeat of Mao's 49 to 76 reign. And Xi is completing his second 5-year term. But at the beginning of this one, he didn't bring any younger people in who would be ready to take over and serve the next 5 years. So everything has been orchestrated. He's aimed toward in Congress late October, early November, to be granted another 5-year term as Secretary General of the party, Chairman of the Military Commission, and the following March, another 5-year term as president. He probably will, almost certainly will change out the prime minister. Clear evidence of that was the prime minister speaking up this last week, critical of some of the handling of the current lockdown. So he knows he's not going to be reappointed.
Yeah.
But the prime candidate to replace him had been the mayor of Shanghai. That may not be as likely, given how they play out as Shanghai comes out from under almost 2-month lockdown. She had, as I indicated earlier, in these last 2 or 3 years, begun to provide more controls over the private sector and to talk about shared prosperity. That's disappeared in the last 4 or 5 months. He's no longer talking about shared prosperity. And he's eased up some of the controls on Alibaba, Tencent, some of the other big companies. They may realize dealing with the declining growth, he needs those companies to be growing again, not cutting off employees in the process. So
in the big
things
picture
to watch. But the concern I hear from a lot of friends is she going to watch what's going on in Ukraine and decide it's time to go take Taiwan. The one thing Mao never accomplished in the process. My view has been, still is, that getting his 3rd term in place is a higher priority than taking Taiwan by force. What he will do in that 3rd term with regard to Taiwan is clearly a prospect of hostilities. And if we learned any lesson from Ukraine, after the taking Crimea and the incursion into eastern Ukraine, the then President Poroshenko, later Zelensky, asked for modern equipment. Poroshenko asked for modern air defense, anti-missile equipment, and the Obama administration declined to sell it to him. Looking at where we are now and racing to try to get in military equipment to sustain their resistance, I would say now is the time that we should encourage Taiwan to dramatically increase its anti-missile and air defense capabilities, and to think about what they visibly can do to put anti-amphibious invasion prospects in place, to make it visible to Xi of what the cost would be if he were to try to use force to bring Taiwan into range.
Yes. Yeah, we're seeing a lot of similarities, congruency between China and Taiwan and Russia and Ukraine. So I'm curious, who do you see as the biggest threat to U.S. national security? Is it China or Russia?
Well, right now it's Russia, clearly, is rattling the nuclear chain in the process. China is the greater long-term competitor. We have some influence over whether it's a competitor or a hostile threat. And that's because there's no past history through the centuries of the 2 largest economies having totally different political systems, totally different cultures, histories, social systems, and yet markets that are intertwined. Very large interplay. So the issue, can we sustain the competition where we are not harmed by it, but that where access to markets causes Xi not to be inclined to take the kinds of steps we see Putin taking, overtly using it. So if we were to cut China off from economic opportunity, then they might well surpass Russia over time as a military threat.
Mm-hmm. Now, as a matter of global stability here, what do you think is the biggest concern or threat to the world? Is it a nuclear exchange? Is it something external like that, hot conflict, or is it internal, like cultural subversion?
We're about to run out of time, but
okay.
Inman's view of the world I have for years. Proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is the greatest threat. And of that, it's nuclear more than chemical or biological. Second, used to be global terrorism. That's been replaced by pandemics. And that's likely to be a continuing fact of life for us. Third, cyber threat, cyber conflict. Terrorism is still there. That's four. And international narcotics trafficking continues to be, it's number five. Then if you move away from the clear threats to challenges, global warming, climate change, migration from Africa into Europe. We see it now out of Ukraine. We saw it earlier out of Syria. Its impact all across Europe. Social media has access to those who would do harm to us, or everything from ransomware to flood of disinformation, misinformation, interference in our elections. Mm-hmm. So those are all challenges we have to worry about. It. How do we manage them? But at the top of the list is clearly nuclear.
Okay. And my one final question, and this can be very brief. There's about a 70-year age difference between us, which is quite remarkable. That's many years of experiences, conflicts, lessons. And I want to know, is there anything you would tell yourself if you were just starting out 70 years earlier? Maybe some wisdom or advice you'd like to pass on to future generations?
Curiosity. Finding things, what are you interested in? How do you pursue that curiosity? And as you identify problems, as you identify opportunities, can you come up with solutions to them along the way? Compassion. Compassion for those who are less fortunate, who have not had the educational opportunities that we share in the process along the way. We are fortunate to live in a democracy, albeit one that's going through another cycle of troubles that seems to happen about every 30 or 40 years in the process. And every time it comes along, we act as though it's never happened before in the process. But you have difficulty solving problems when you're so polarized. And as I look at the polls on almost any issue, you have 20, 30% pretty far to the right, 20 to 30% pretty far to the left, and a large block in between. Many of us now call ourselves independents in the process. How do you effectively govern? How do you find solutions that help the majority of the population? You're not going to find any solutions that help everybody. But how do you, in fact, find the greater good for the vast majority? On that, wish you great good luck over the next 70 years.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you, Blaine. Bye.